Hey, welcome to Refocused Radio. We are here once again, and just like any other time, we have another amazing show lined for y'all today. Today, we're going to be talking all about Dr. Sara Erdner. She is someone that you're going to really love. She has an amazing journey that as a PhD focus on coach-athlete relationships. She has a book that you need to go to. Website is super easy, dearcoachbook.com. She really unpacks some of the things that we probably overlook. I was part of sports. I didn't make it big, but I'm just saying we know how it is. Sometimes we have a coach that kind of gets a little bit loud, a little bit, kind of over animated. But she has some powerful stories and case studies that I feel that you will really appreciate, especially if you are a coach or an athlete yourself. So once again, I want to say to Sara, thank you for being on. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me here.
Well, I appreciate you clearing your calendar. I know you're swamped. I thought I was swamped, but you're the one that's flying everywhere and doing all these lectures and presentations. So we'll get right to the chase. Kind of start out, first of all, with your studies. What inspired you to say, you know what, I want to tap into this and kind of dig deeper?
Absolutely. When I was in my PhD, something that they would talk about was very much you want to get your dissertation done. So who's the population that you can have easy access to? And that was actually coaches, because we didn't have a lot of barriers to access to the athletes. And so I started out doing that just for ease and getting that research going. But as I was having those interviews with coaches and doing the research, they were like, we want to know what the athletes think about the coach-athlete relationship. And I was like, I hear you. And I thought, you know what, for my dissertation, I'm going to bite that bullet and I know it's going to be a lot harder to get access to the athletes themselves, but I would rather do the 1 to 2, 3 extra steps to hear those lived experiences. And what was supposed to be 60 to 90-minute interviews were like 2.5, 3-hour long conversations, because it became very, very clear that I was the first person that was a neutral person to them. I wasn't a teammate. I wasn't a parent. I wasn't somebody that was already invested in their life in any other way, that was sitting down saying, what can coaches do better by you? And it just was this spring of knowledge that came. So in academia, most times what happens is you do this research and then you publish it to journals, and that just stays behind a paywall and people aren't really getting those stories. So I went a little off the beaten path and decided, you know what, like did the dissertation, and all my committee was like, you need to write a book, like this information needs to get out there. So I bypassed the research journal publication component. I teach at a predominantly teaching university too, so I have the privilege of doing that, and found a publisher and published these stories in a confidential manner, of course, because we know that there's power dynamics within sport, and people, they don't want the backlash of a coach maybe finding out it was them and then they don't get playing time. But my ultimate, where my heart is at in doing this, is not to point the finger at coaches and say, you're bad and here's how you can be better. It really, the energy I brought to it was empathizing with coaches. And when you read between the lines of what the athletes are saying, you realize that there's not a lot of support for coaches. And so that's the tone in which the book is written. The letters themselves are constructive in nature. I did coach the athletes through those. I mean, some of them started out with like, I hate you, you're awful. And I was like, hey, I hear you, that's valid. And let's remember that the audience, I really want this to be an educational book. So that was a really powerful process too, was not necessarily leading the athlete to say something that wasn't their own words, but helping them use their story to feel like that they could educate coaches on how to better show up for athletes in the future.
I like how you made the point of the world of the coach and the athlete. I mean, unless you're in that world, you really don't have a clue what's going on when there's a timeout or halftime in the locker room. From your experience and research, what role does creating a safe space in boosting the performance for the athlete and coach? Because the coach, they're on the line as well.
Absolutely. I want to speak more about the coach here because it's a trickle-down effect. We saw this in speaking to the athletes, having the letters come through. If the coach is not mentally healthy themselves and if their well-being isn't centered, then the safe environment has already been it's not as safe as it could be because the coach themselves don't feel safe. They don't feel mentally taken care of. So we philosophically across the years, decades ago, it was very much a coach-centered philosophy, and then now we've shifted the pendulum to an athlete-centered philosophy. And I argue for a relationship-centered philosophy where the coach is center stage with the athlete. Oftentimes, the coach is looked at as a means to an end. They're hired, retained, and fired based on whether the athletes perform or not. And I just feel like we're not unconditionally positively regarding the coach as an entity in and of themselves. They're a human being that we should care about. They have feelings. They're sacrificing so much time with their family, with their kids, and the stress of that. And then also needing to have, depending on what level they're playing, maybe 18-year-old bodies are determining whether they get to stay on it, they get to keep their job or not. So something that I feel like we do a good job, I think we've done a good job at different organizational levels for athlete mental health initiatives. But those are just a Band-Aid approach if we don't have mentally healthy coaches, if we're not centering coach well-being as the first and foremost. I see a lot of, with me doing coaching education, I've looked at a lot of coaching education materials across the Olympic committees, across different NGB, national governing bodies. And it's always like the X's and O's, the tactical, all this stuff. And then the last module is like, oh yeah, coaching well-being. Don't forget about your well-being. And it's like, if we just look at the optics there, you're basic, like this is like an afterthought. Coach well-being is an afterthought. My argument is let's bring that to the center so that coaches feel taken care of as a human first. When they feel mentally healthier and also psychologically safer themselves as taken care of by the administration, that unconditional positive regard for the coaches will then trickle down to the athletes. So it's not about, hey, coaches, here's what you can do, A plus B equals C, to make your athletes feel psychologically safer, and then thus they'll optimally perform. But how can we also bring that formula in for coaches? It's a very complex web. So you might, when I look back at my coaches that didn't necessarily show it well for me, and I think empathetically of like, gosh, what were they going through at the time and what resources did they have to take care of them? I know a coach of mine was dealing with cancer. Their wife was diagnosed with cancer. Did they have the time to go to mental health therapy to deal with that on top of the travel schedule that they had? I don't think they were doing that. Maybe they were, but so that's what the book is really here for, is to start the conversation. I don't situate myself as the expert with a capital T. I am an expert. I do have points that I would bring to the conversation around that table. But I think that like you yourself, you were an athlete. You also have you probably have really good suggestions to bring to that table too. So let's empathetically start a conversation on how to create safest sport environment for all stakeholders, not just athletes.
And when you look at how people will view this as listeners, one, if they just know someone that was a coach or an athlete, they're going to be more curious to know, well, wow, we're used to just going to the game, going home. And if our team gets fortunate enough to be in championship game, then we're going to go crazy. But once it's over and the confetti drops, everyone's going their merry way. But to your point, coaches and players collectively have to go through this series of, okay, how are we going to perform in the game? And if we're in that championship game, how much pressure are we going to have, or are we not going to have that much pressure because of how, like you're explaining the interview, how they tackle things? Because if they're not tackling it the right way, then there's this friction that is going to either cause someone to break, or it's just going to be something interesting at the off season. So my next question will be, what was probably a key lesson that you read from a coach or athlete that say, you know what, wow, that makes sense, that there's so much pressure, quote unquote, being built either in season or off season?
Yeah, I think it was actually there were two things that I this brings up for me. As I was writing the book, I was we had our end of the year university party where the athletics and professors and faculty all come together. And I was sitting around a table with a bunch of coaches and talking about my book getting published and speaking about the empathy that I have for coaches and really wanting to center this coach mental health initiative and speaking about coach burnout and a couple of my colleagues in the field that do that research. And this coach started tearing up and he like took his glasses off and I was like, what's going on? Like, what's resonating with you right now? And he said, I've never had somebody center the coach, like care for the coach like this, and then went into a specific example of dealing with the death of somebody in his family. But no, it was just the thought of like, I just have to show up to I can't show up to practice and break down in front of the athletes. Like I have to have my shit together. And that it was like the first time in his 20 years of coaching that he had ever had somebody be like, you matter in and of yourself. And why don't we have these things in place? And the pressure, I remember him saying the pressure I felt to have to put this very intimate death, like something that really, really affected me. Like obviously he got some time off, but not enough. I mean, the grieving process doesn't care about, capitalism and productivity culture. And so him coming back and him navigating, he felt like he was being fake, but he wanted to be vulnerable, but what's the line of being too vulnerable? He didn't have the time because they were in season and traveling to really dedicate to therapy. And if he did, he was nervous that, well, what if I have this therapy session and then I just cry the whole time and I have to show up for the athletes after? And they don't know how to navigate that space. So that story really, really hit home for me and was really a blessing for me to receive that story because I thought that this person's not alone. This isn't a singular instance. The book is broken down into part 1 or thank you letters, actually, which was surprising to me to receive. My bias was that if I ask athletes, what do you wish you could have told your coach but never did, it's going to be all bad. I actually received thank you letters via email, which speaks to the absolute issue of lack of communication on either side of the pendulum. Like we're just saying, thanks, coach, and walking off without giving like really, really due diligence on what do you mean by that? What are you actually thankful for? So there's a lack of communication across the board. And then when you get into the part 2, which are more of the like, and I hate that I almost labeled it the not so good letters because they're still good. There's goodness to them. They're just more critical in nature. They're in part 1, the thank you letter, there was an athlete saying that there was one about the coach whose wife was diagnosed with cancer and how they really like saw them struggling with that. And they saw that the coach was really trying to figure out how to navigate being a coach while also being a human. And there was a lot there and they wished the coach had more. So it was that letter paired with like this other coach, the separate instance where I was like, gosh, this is, and the unfortunate truth, and I hate this, and why I want to advocate so bad for coach mental health. I don't want us to wait for a coach to kill themselves. Like that there's suicide. Like athlete mental health initiatives came when we started seeing more athletes killing themselves. Oh, now we have to do something. Really, off the backs of these people's bodies? We don't need to wait for the coach that's so stressed and they have their family stuff at home. They just had a kid born. They're not spending time with them. They feel guilty for that. They're burnt out because they're working 78 hours a week. The stress of them losing their job because they're not having a great season. Like, do we really need to wait for there to be a death sentence for us to care about this? So let's mitigate that. So that was a big thing. Another thing I wanted to touch on quickly, when I was first writing the book, the first draft of it, I offered a letter and then I offered my expertise on what the audience should get out of that letter. And I was teaching a methods of coaching class and I stopped dead in my tracks in the middle of teaching because I was telling the students, as coaches, you need to step back more. You need to listen to the athlete's voice. And I stopped dead in my tracks and I thought, well, damn, I'm actually writing this book in the exact opposite way of what I'm teaching. So I stepped out of the class, I called my editor and I was like, Amanda, I think I need to like rewrite this book. I need to stop talking as much and I need to gather more letters and I need to make this book more calling people into a conversation rather than me situating myself as the expert with a capital T, which is exactly how sport is. Like, I'm the coach and I tell you what to do and you're considered a good athlete if you play the way I coach you, versus it's a collaboration, it's the relationship. Athletes, especially depending on if you're at like the Olympic, professional, collegiate level, they know how to coach themselves to some degree. You know, it's about collaborating with them. So I went in, I admitted to my students what I did, and I was like, I'm going to use myself as a real life lesson right now. And I rewrote the book. I started out with 10 letters. I'm ending with a handful more. And I have journal prompts in between. My favorite quote from my favorite quote ever is, a book read by 1,000 different people is 1,000 different books. So if I come in and tell you as the reader what to get out of this letter, I am disrespecting your lived experience on how you're interacting with that letter and what you're resonating with. So it's rather, out of this letter that you just read, what should you keep doing that's inspired? What should you stop doing? What should you start doing? So again, let's start the conversation. Obviously, in part 3 of the book, I add my expertise in there and offer some research and kind of different directions that I think we should take, some of which I'm speaking about here, which is coaching health initiatives, mental health initiatives. But what I'm hoping by sharing this story is that reflective practice. I mean, I have a PhD, I'm a professor, I teach students, and then I had to stop myself dead in my tracks and say, oh, let me take accountability for how I'm actually exacerbating the problem on a meta level. And that's the level of humility that I really hope those that read the book can just be like, hey, let's just put our egos down. We've done the best we could up to this point, but we can still get better as well.
You literally took the words out of my mouth, because the first thing I was thinking was humble, as you were saying what you were saying, because it does take humility from someone like yourself who has this education, who has these credentials, to say, time out. I know I have these titles and I can run laps around the average people who are not in this realm, but you still say, you know what? I still had to have a listening ear to who is being affected by this. And I think that should be applauded, because you don't always get that. Sometimes you get the opposite, where it's like, wait, hold up, like, I'm kind of the one that you need, so you should be thanking me for even trying to write this book. That's a great I would say mindset. That's a great approach that you took, because you don't always get that when we live in a space, may not be everywhere on this earth, but in some areas we sometimes feel that I have to be looked at as the source of good information. And I think that's a great point. My next follow-up question to that is, I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of professional athletes, they're on podcast shows, but not just that, they are doing podcast shows as far as hosting them. And I've been listening to some, and what's interesting is that they want to have a voice in what's happening outside the court. And my question for you is, with your research, have you been able to notice a pattern where athletes or coaches are doing the same? Are they being a little bit more vocal about bigger issues outside the game?
Yeah, I think there is, I almost want to speak about pressure here. I think some athletes feel pressured to, like, well, if you have a platform, you should use it. I've seen that a lot with social media. So I want to couch this within a specific theory that I use as a mental performance consultant, which is self-determination theory. And that's on a continuum between being amotivated. It's a theory of motivation between being amotivated and intrinsically motivated. And in the middle of that continuum are these 4 different extrinsic motivations. So being externally motivated, so you're playing to receive money and awards and accolades, to please the coach, etc. Intrinsic or internal motivation is very much just doing, and that intrinsic internal motivation is connected to higher levels of performance. It's about connecting your performance to the value of the task at hand, just loving the game for the game. And a residual effect can obviously be accolades, but that's not why you're doing it. And one of the things is connecting athletes to their values. So let's reconnect with what your values are. First of all, understanding values are fluid. So usually every year, sometimes every 6 months, we'll revisit their values. Back when I was in graduate school, my number one value was learning because I was in a learning environment. Now it's, I just actually redid it a couple months ago, and it's autonomy. And so navigating, what does that mean as far as performance? So to me, what I do with an athlete is it's not, I don't want to make a blanket statement to say, yes, every athlete and every coach wants to be a part of these bigger issues and talking about them. I do think, again, my number one value right now is autonomy. It's agency. It's asking people, what do you feel comfortable with doing? And if it is, Colin Kaepernicking, whatever situation it is you're going into, how is that values driven? So to me, if you're making a decision as it's values driven, and maybe their number one value is advocacy. Okay, awesome. Then they know that the decisions they're making is values driven. Personally, it's not influenced by the pressure. It's not an extrinsic pressure that they feel like they have to do it. It's an internal agency that they want to do. So the way I wrote the book, the way I'm speaking in this podcast and every other podcast, I feel like I'm a facilitator of space. I don't feel, again, I'm not the expert with a capital T. So I love that these athletes that are getting out there and doing the podcast and speaking about these heavier, hotter topics that are out there, and other people have opinions of like, just, shoot the basketball, don't talk about racism. And I'm like, okay, that's taking a person's agency away. Okay. So that's where I have a problem when people are like, oh, you're just an athlete. I mean, they're a human first. I mean, coaches are the same. We saw, gosh, I'm like blanking on the coach's name. The Golden State Warriors, he got up, Steve Kerr, and he got up and spoke about the presidential election, and he was there for Kamala. And I thought that was just a beautiful, that was his agency, his choice to be able to get up and speak that way. So take away from it the political charge of who he was standing up there for. It's the free speech and being able to talk about what you want. You can intersect that though. I mean, I'm very much about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's why I wrote the book. There's some letters in there that speak about that, about people that had a white coach and themselves was a marginalized individual, and they did feel like racism was present. And I think that's something we need to center. We do not need to put that on the back burner from an accountability and humility standpoint of just saying like, hey, we were born in this society. So I think if people are talking in terms of speaking down on people, that's really hard. But when I can tether it to an athlete or coach's value system, what do you value and how is that driving your decisions? Whether that's a podcast or just talking to their friends or not, it's just how can they feel safe in that moment of what they're doing?
Once again, listen on Refocused Radio, talking to our special guest today, Sara. You have a website that people need to go to, is darecoachbook.com. But before we run out of time, I have to ask you another question in regards to how you see culture is culture. I mean, we live in a world where music is very colorful. It's different vibes, different tempos, different genres. But I want to mirror that to people's personalities, right? It's not all one box of this is exactly how we are and how we operate. My last question for you is, how can organizations who have the responsibility of taking care of these coaches, to take care of these athletes, how can organizations do a better job in making sure that they're not just instilling excellence, but they also are having a listening ear of what's really going on?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things I end the book with is like, hey, coach, if you're reading this, you also were an athlete. So you write your own Dear Coach letter, like retroactively, and then reread that back to yourself, like from like an athlete that possibly could have written this to you. And then be open-minded to some of that journal prompts that come to you. But another thing I do is I tell the coach to write a Dear Sport letter, maybe a Dear Sport Administrator, of like, what do you wish the sport administration did differently? And if you feel comfortable communicating that with your bosses, with the people above you, maybe sport administrators reading this book. So again, it's about starting the conversation. I think when we're talking about social change, which is what I'm asking, we're talking decade, decade plus of change. So that's why I'm not coming in hard saying this is what we need to do. So I think if administrators can come in and think about how can I call people into a conversation, maybe even just asking the question, what do you wish you could tell me but haven't yet? And understanding that this is a safe environment. If that means bringing in a third party, I've actually been contracted to come into some Wall Street companies to do some of that third party work, to ask their employees, what do you wish you could tell your boss but never did? And then do not necessarily outing the athletes, but doing kind of a thematic matrix so that I can go to the boss and kind of speak on the behalf of the employees. I've done that before, but it takes the boss being open minded to that. And so if that's, it can be harmful as well if a boss is really just wanting to use that to see like who's loyal versus not. And that's another issue at hand. So again, humility. Like if you really want to see forward movement and really want to create psychological safety, reach out, and we can figure out a good program to move you forward so that all voices are heard, from the athletes to the coaches to the administrators.
I know I said that was the last question, but one more follow-up question is, when you think about the word tradition, that's something that's very rich to every single team. In some ways, or should I ask, frame it this way, have you seen in some ways that tradition gets in the way of progress, or have you seen it that it's how they use it and carry it?
From my perspective, I feel like tradition gets in the way more times than not, because the word culture, you used that earlier, we oftentimes it's used to prescribe. So the coach will come in and say, this is the culture. And the insinuation is that the athlete has to prescribe to that in order for them to achieve excellence. Culture is based on every single body that is a part of that team, that organization. And when you add a player, deduct a player, add a coach, deduct a coach, the culture changes. So, and that culture represents the religions, it represents the race, the different cultures that are associated with that race, right? So to me, we have to broaden our understanding what culture is, and culture oftentimes doesn't, like when we think about tradition, it's very much in this, like, well, this is what we've always done. And I think about baseball, for example, very traditional sport, and it's very militant in a way. Like the guys have to have their hair cut a certain way, they can't wear jewelry, they have to wear the same uniforms. So let's just make you all uniform, when in reality, talking about self-determination theory, there's 3 components of self-determination theory that can help ease somebody up the motivation ladder, which is relatedness, competence, and autonomy. Well, autonomy is like if somebody wants to wear pink cleats to the game, or there was a Michigan gymnast recently, I forget their name, who wore their Michigan attire for the gymnastics meet at a USA qualifying event, and I think they got deducted points for that, but they felt more comfortable in their Michigan attire. We think about the volleyball players who don't want to wear the suction tight booty shorts because they don't want to be objectified, but then they get kicked out or disqualified from an Olympic match because they're doing that because of tradition, right? Like, let's let people show up in the way they want. If men want to have beards when they play because it makes them feel more professional and more like a man, what's the problem in doing that? But then the coaches are saying, oh, well, you need to cut it because that's just what we've always done. And I feel like that whole tradition, what we've always done, when it's coming at it from a fixed mindset like that, actually hinders individual performance. And that hindering of individual performance is going to impact team performance. The dominoes fall where they may.
And those watching and listening, you can literally watch or read some stories. I won't mention the team in baseball, but the writers on the wall, you can kind of figure that out. But yeah, I remember reading something about that earlier this year, where they're starting to kind of loosen the grip on what they call is what they want, is what I would say, versus today's time of reality of what actually doesn't really matter what they are trying to say. But that's another show.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother conversation. So once again, talking to our guest, Sara, go to her website, dearcoachbook.com. Might have to have you back on in the future because this was really a great perspective. So like I always want to say to you, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I would love another podcast time if we could just keep going down these rabbit holes.